Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back, Brad.
Yeah, welcome.
Depending on when you're listening to this, you may not have noticed it or not, but Brad was out and we had Bob last time. It was awesome.
Bob Strachan filled in. He did a good Brad.
What? Oh, did he? Did he? Okay. I'm glad.
He's been listening to you really closely.
No, I haven't listened to the episode yet, so I'm excited to hear. But you always sound more sophisticated when you have a British accent. And so I think I'm going to riff off Bob a little bit and bring that to the table, and maybe
I would love that.
we should all come in with our we all think
The
we could
best
do
British
we
accent?
probably all think we can do a British accent, but
We're awful at it.
I'm sure we're all awful.
Mine's
at it.
really good.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's kind of like when British people do an American accent.
yes.
What is that?
Yeah.
They take the stereotypes, right?
Yeah, mine's horrible.
I'm always intrigued at these British actors who you've watched for years and they've always played an American, and they're like, "What? They're
know, isn't that
British?"
weird?
And I'm like, "Really?" I'm like, "Well, I didn't know that." And then you see them on an interview, and next thing you know, you're like, "That's the same person."
All right.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty good craft.
Is there Americans in Britain that play Brits?
I don't know. I got to think about that for a second.
Fact check that.
So what are we going to talk about today, guys?
Well, I think today we're going to talk about how to sell strategy with your clients and how to sell creative. They're both very challenging at times. Sometimes you don't see eye to eye with your client. Sometimes your clients, they make decisions by a group effort, which is sometimes challenging because you have a lot of people, a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and that may not be making decisions based on a vision.
When you say sell creative, you don't mean close new business.
No,
but
not close new business.
sell
I'm
the
talking
idea.
about influencing your customer in buying into a creative strategy.
I was actually thinking sell.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about selling the creative strategy to your clients. Like, how do you get them to see the vision? How do you get them to understand what you're trying to do with their brand, and how to make, creative can be very subjective. It can be very opinion based on taste, and not sometimes a lot of times clients don't look at the creative from a strategy. Of a strategy that you put together. So anyways, I think those are some good topics to talk about today.
Yeah, let's do it. I know, Brad, you're big into creative, and we've talked about it before. We're all big into creative, but I know that's something that's
Brad's got the history.
He's got the history, man.
Well, I'm
He's got the
definitely
history.
I'm definitely a brand guy.
There you go.
But
Brad's
it may,
a brand guy.
Well, it may be because I love brands, and I think we all do. And I think it's funny. I look at my father's still, he's still alive and he's in his 70s. And I look at that generation and I definitely see a switch of people. Like there's people in that age and demographic who don't seem to care as much about the brand. You know what I mean? They're like, they just want the product. They don't really care as much about it. They don't see it almost. They don't see the packaging of the product. They don't see the way it's positioned very well. And then all of a sudden there's a switch once you start getting a little younger. And I think it's just because it's just the era that we've grown up in. And so, so I think it's really important. I've seen it make a big difference. I've seen products in my past that don't really have a unique selling proposition, that are just kind of another, they don't really have any super uniqueness to the competitor, actually shine because they just built a better brand. And so I spent my career working on brands that had a lot of brand equity, and how protective we were of our brands because we knew that without that, sometimes it's hard to compete.
I actually think, this is not exactly the same subject, but when you get into the subject of brand, I often say, that brand is the only competitive advantage that you have, right? Like,
yes.
And we've talked about that on this podcast regarding agency brands, like the brand of your agency, And so how does creative in your mind, because it's not the same, right? But it's a manifestation of the brand. How does the creative connect to that?
Well, you're talking about specifically, it depends on your customer, I guess. And you're talking about, there's brands, sometimes you might work for a customer or client that has a brand, has protected it for years, understands it very, very well. And you'll go into, let's say you work with a new client, you will know the guardrails. They're already created so that it's very difficult to go outside of those guardrails. So you're not, as an agency, you're not going to destroy the brand, right? Maybe down the road you might, if you
Not
get,
yet.
yeah, if you can, but up front you might not. But if you're working with a smaller company that maybe it's a new product, and the brand hasn't been established, and maybe on your client side there's the people you're working with don't understand really their brand very well, then at that point you've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I've experienced, and we use the term selling brand and brand strategy, is you've got to be the one that brings clarity to your client. And I think that's the biggest issue, because many times clients already think they have a brand or that their brand is halfway decent. And so the sales process is to convince them that, you can take it to the next level that will result in higher market share and higher conversions and sales. And sometimes that's really tough, right?
Yeah.
Because you've got demographic subjectivity, meaning age is influenced by that, generations, location, how long they've been running their own business. They're kind of, siloed inside that, thinking, well, we don't, we've used this name. It's a family name forever, and we've had this message, and it's worked. But helping to bring clarity for me, I think that's the deciding factor as an agency, is if you can clarify their brand and their messaging to them, and then help them to clarify what it should be to the public. I think that's really, because I think this whole idea of brand and creative, it's just so fuzzy and it's so ethereal at times. It's just like, I like that logo. Well, I hate it. Well, I like that color. So, well, does it even matter?
Yeah.
What's a Google? They're successful with it.
Would you have named your brand or company Google?
Right.
I mean, who thought, right? I always tell people that we don't ever create for creative sake, ever. And that any name can be a great brand, any name. And it's the brand isn't
That's a great point.
Your brand isn't your logo or your name. It's the values you put to those, the name and the identity,
and how you communicate those
and how
values.
you communicate those values. Now, Nike, paid, I don't know, $30 or something for their logo. Their logo could have been anything, but it's the billions of dollars that they've spent putting value into their logo. That is the value of the logo, of the name.
So is it purely money?
No, I think it's positioning. I think that it's, it's funny to say, but just do it, right? That really started, I think, the first time, at least that I can remember with Nike, that they've actually attributed value or something to their brand that took it to the next level. It was just that, it was the attitude, right? That buying Nikes are going to make me faster. They're going to make me better. They're going to make my life fuller. They're going to, all of these brand messages that when we think about Nike, we think about going the distance, going beyond, and that didn't happen overnight, obviously.
It's that aspiration.
Yeah.
Right. And so
it's encouraging.
I mean, if you can help, and I think this is true inside of agency brands as well, but I think if you can help your customer see themselves where they want to be, then that's powerful.
One of the challenges that I find, especially with like startup businesses and brands that we're building, is that sometimes the customer likes their product, they believe in their product, but they really don't think about who their customers are. And sometimes that's tough, because if they don't know who their customers are, it's really difficult to position a brand to everyone. Like, let's create one brand that is accessible to the world. And so every demographic is going to find something unique with it. Even Nike, though they're very broad, they don't do that.
Do you go through an exercise typically with your clients, like to determine who those customers are, right?
Yeah, we do a lot of exercises where we really break down, look at the value propositions of the product, look at the uniqueness, do research, competitive research, and then we really break down the journey of who to purchase this, why would they purchase, what are their purchasing decisions that they're going to need to make, and so we really outline the strategy of the brand. We create brand guardrails, how we're going to position the brand, what our personality is. We develop customer personas. So before we even begin creative, we have a very strict guidelines of what we're trying to create. And before we start with creative, we get the client to really see and validate that what we put together and what the strategy is correct in their mind. And I think that's the key to selling creative, is to never sell creative that's just based on creative alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you almost never just show it to someone for the first time and say, hey, I mean, that's not the way to sell it. You sell it over time.
Yeah.
You have, you get validation along the way with little steps, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of how we've done it. But it's not, most people don't end up there at first, but there's really there's kind of an analytical approach that you're going through. You're validating, okay, here's who it's for and here's what they like. Okay, that's number one. Here's the purchase decisions, those kind of things. And you're putting guardrails in place, and then you're saying, you're kind of getting buy-in as you go along, because ultimately the way you sell creative to any one person is they have to be bought into it. Yeah. Right. And they probably at some level still have to like it themselves, even if they're not their target customer. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's that process that kind of leads up to it. Right. So you're really not just selling one thing. You've sold it already. By the time they see something, they're already sold on it.
I think another key element to this too, to your point, Ken, is selling creative to clients can be really effective if you're able to bring data into it, meaning research, and really saying, I know I've seen this before in other industries where you have maybe a CEO or creative, or maybe the business owner is creative, or maybe they're in a creative business themselves. And so they have very strong opinions about what needs to be the brand, or what it needs to say, or how it needs to look. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, because, we all think our children are perfect, right? So, and then everybody on the outside is like, man, Ken's kids are brats, and that's not true. But I'm just saying, hypothetically, that's a metaphor for saying, we all are very skewed and biased. So if we can bring data into it, right? Like say, well, how do you
do that with something that's creative?
Well, I think you can take as simple as taking 5 concepts or 3 concepts and really using some sort of source, and we can talk about this.
Yeah.
But to really do, some qualitative analytics and just run it by 100 people that are your target demographic and have them vote. Which one do you like the most? What speaks to you?
One of the most frustrating things that kind of gets me under the skin a little bit is watching a pitch creative, and there's zero data and zero strategy to why they made the decisions they've made. It's the most frustrating things, because you think that person, though they may be a great designer, they may be a great visual, they didn't really understand the strategy going into it. They didn't really understand what they're trying to do, because it's so funny. I find these people who come out of school and they're trained in graphic communication, but really what they're trained in is graphic arts. They're really more, it's almost like fine art. They're never really taught how to actually create something that sells products, or how to communicate. It's graphic communication is the key. It's communication. They've never taught how to build, right, something that is emotionally drives a communication message, and that's sometimes very frustrating. A lot of folks, if you're listening, you may be a whiz, you may know the software really well, you may know Photoshop and Illustrator, and you may be the best artists in the world, but if you can't communicate and stay within the lanes of what what you're trying to communicate in the brand, it doesn't matter how beautiful something looks because it may not actually be on point.
Yeah.
And that's one of my biggest frustrations. And then never get too close to your creative. I don't know if I told this story, but I had a copywriting class by this lead copywriter over at Y&R in Detroit. And he made us stay up all night writing these campaigns. We had to pitch the next morning. We all were like had 1 or 2 hours of sleep. This is no joke. And he came in and you'd present and he just ripped us all a new one. To the point where there's one girl, I remember she started crying and he went over because he ripped up her stuff right in the middle of the class and said it was crap. And we all were like, what is going on with this guy? We've worked like our tail off. And he stopped and he said, you know what? I did this on purpose because I want you guys to know you can't get too attached to your creative. He said, and I never forgot that. He's like, you're going to go into pitches. You guys are going to all work together as a team for weeks and you're going to pitch something and the client is going to say, I don't like that. And they don't even give you a reason why. They just don't like it because they're their taste. And he's like, you can't get too caught up in it. You can't get too attached to it. And so, but the more that you can present with data, the more that you've done your homework prior to that, where you're always going back to the strategy and you're saying, this is why we made this choice. And you're going back to strategy and you're like, this is the strategy that we've all agreed upon, even the client. So if you're deciding something different now, you're changing your mind to what you've agreed to with the strategy. And so you always go back to the strategy. You'll always go back to the data. And if you're ever on the fence, there's a lot of fun tools to use to try to get some user interactions to actually put this in front of a focus group and start to get some data.
I think the more that you can remove subjectivity and those things, you can bring clarity. And I think that's the key is I think our job as an agency is to continue to remove subjectivity, not that you don't bring the best art and design, but you remove the subjectivity so that everyone at the table can say, why do I need to trust you that this message, this logo, this colors, whatever it may be in the context of that brand journey, is the best and will resonate the best, and I need to spend money with you. I think that's really the key, is what are the tools that I can remove subjectivity and bring clarity to what the brand is. Can I take us down a little rabbit trail based on something you said? Because I think there's something really good there. You mentioned that you can't get too connected to your work, and I know that this is maybe you're more connected to things that maybe you're more creative, that you've spent more time in. So there's probably a spectrum there. However, in an agency world, I mean, there's a lot of times where you're too close to your work, or not even too close, but you're connected to your work. And then we all know that, the clients have all sorts of personalities. They're under all sorts of stress. And so, it's really easy to get down about stuff. Yeah. And so for instance, I was talking with someone on my team yesterday, and we had moved up an initiative by 2 weeks or so to try and meet a deadline that was not originally in the timeline. Moved heaven and earth to do it, delivered it, and this client's under particular stress, and so it wasn't intentional, but they were like, great, now there's a couple things wrong with this, and so we need those fixed by tomorrow. And it's like, how about thank you?
Yeah.
And so they were kind of communicating that it was just like, it was wearing, it's like to feel like you did something really, really great and not to get an appreciation back. And so I was talking to her and I was saying, I totally get that. I think that, I don't think it's intentional, but I also think that somehow we need to protect ourselves from, our source of energy coming from the person that you're giving it to. And we need to get our source of energy from some other place.
Yeah.
And it gets into actual, other areas of life, but are there tactics that you have or guardrails that you have even personally to avoid yourself being too connected to what you're delivering? Because like you said, ultimately you got to stay away from it.
Well, I grew up I started in the creative side of agency world. I went to school to be an art director, and so I love art. I love design, but for me, it was always a bigger picture. It was always about, I love seeing my clients actually get results, and than the actual creative. I always knew I was taught early on that I had to provide a few different roads to the same destination. And so I never got too connected. I could feel more subjective or objective, I guess, to what I was doing, where I was almost my own worst critic of my own stuff. And I think I never fell in love with it. I fell in love with the process. I fell in love with the end result. But I wanted to explore, right? And I think that's my mindset is, let's continue to explore, because we're not there yet. Let's continue to explore. And where a lot of people, when they start a design project, they get into it so much, or create a project, that it envelops them, and they quit thinking about what the strategy is anymore, and they're going, what do I feel good about? What do I like? What do I think? You don't know how many people, creative people I've talked to in the years, are like, well, why did you use that color? They'll say, oh, because it just, I felt like it was a modern color and it felt right for, but I'm like, but that wasn't the strategy. It's not the same strategy. So you can tell they start falling in love with it so much that they start to forget about what's going on. And they start fighting for things that are the opposite of the strategy. When your creative starts to fight for things that are opposite of the strategy, you know that they've all fallen in love with it. They have a love affair with it that they're not going to be able to let go. And if you can't let go as a creative, you can't think out of the box, because then you just go down that rabbit hole and you're stuck. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I mean that's good. I mean, so have there been situations where, because especially with some things I would say something like creative execution.
Yeah,
it's closer to it. You have to put I think there's more propensity to be connected to it emotionally than maybe other things. But
yes,
maybe that's debatable. But other times where obviously you have to put your heart and soul into selling something to a certain degree. What's the line that you don't go beyond, where you're like, hey, because this could get thrown away. Yeah. I may really think that this is the way to go, but the client may not. And
how I really like to work with creative is, once we develop the strategy and get the buy-in from the strategy, I really like to start throwing ideas, mood boards, so that we don't spend a lot of time on too much. We don't go down the road too far in our design, but we create mood boards that can help us get closer to these guardrails, or at least a design guardrail, creative guardrails, and then look at those mood boards and kind of go down that road. So there's already some guidance to what we're doing. And typically I like a really strong lead brand person to do that, so that there's not they can have help and they can explore, but in the end, we're going to solidify this mood board that our customers also going to like, and say, yeah, that's exactly what we think is right for our strategy, and we all agree to it. And then from there, we build upon that mood board. And, sometimes those mood boards can be different than what your designers want to do, right? Or your creative people want to do. They're like, oh, now you've put me too much in a box. I'm like, well, eventually you need that box. Otherwise, and so, so we try to do it, like you said, in small little baby steps. And then there's a time where we do things where I call it showing our customer the beach. And that's where we try to make a splash in our presentation, but they're just still exploration. They may not actually be what we land on, but we're trying to show them the beach, what could. So we may go push something further down the road, creative, but we might have 2 or 3 different options in that area that we're trying to show them the beach a little bit, to okay, here's a strategy, but here's who you could be. Here's how you could express this in our creativity, visually, or with our positioning, or with whatever else we're bringing to the table. So it really depends on the client, the way that we pitch. It's not the same every time.
So how do you go ahead?
Sorry. I was just going to respond to your question too, and just keep beating the drum of. I think one way that you keep yourself from being attached to is just really develop a good process, so that everybody knows that this is the flow and the process. So it's not going to be all right, here we go. We're going to wrestle this idea away from, the designer, and he's going to be stuck to it. No, everybody in the organization knows that this branding process for the client follows a specific process, and it might be, research, and it might be, like you said, they might having 3 different options, whatever it may be. And I think when people all buy into the process, then nobody's, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be let down if they don't like your favorite idea, but it means that you're less attached to it, and it's less about you having to win and sell your idea or your copy, and it's more about, okay, does the process prove it, and the process will trust it so that it will ultimately lead where you need to go.
We're dealing with this right now with a customer, and a great customer. But I see this all the time. So this is just one scenario that's just popping up right now in my life. But it happens all the time. It's happened throughout my whole career. You pitch something. There's a lot of thoughtfulness. There's strategy. You have tons of meetings where you're pitching ideas, and a lot of the stakeholders within a corporation will all get together, agree. They've seen, they understand the deep strategy, and then the CEO would take something to his wife or something, or to another friend of theirs that is completely not even associated with the strategy, doesn't even know what the strategy is. And somehow they say, I don't like it because of this or something like that. And it's completely off strategy, but it makes such an influence on that person. They start questioning whether it's the right thing. Mm-hmm. And then they start to mix the pot because some outsider told them that they didn't like something, but had no clue about even the strategy or what, And so we see that all the time, and you have to kind of wrangle them back in and try to explain the importance of why we've made the decisions we made. And
I've developed an opinion. I don't know if you would agree with this, but it kind of goes to the thing about any name can be great. I think there's a bar for like visual, for excellence, which is actually a lot lower than I think most people trying to get to. Yeah. And then I think as long as you're above that bar for visual excellence, I think, anything could be made in any logo, visual execution almost can be made into what you need it to be as far as the brand itself. Now, I'm not saying any guardrails, but my point is I think there's maybe overemphasis on some of those elements, a lot of times to where, like you said, you're taking it around everywhere and you're like, and the person's like, I don't want to make the wrong decisions. It's like, you're not going to.
All right.
The wrong decision is going to be continue do this for 3 months. Like that's going to be the wrong decision.
The wrong decision is if you have a really crappy product. That's the wrong decision. You put more effort and energy into the product than you can worry about the brand.
And I would say helping to, part of our strategy when it comes to any of those subjective things, I usually categorize. I like things that are subjective that are deliverables and things that are not. They're completely objective. Like, it's either working or not, or it's whatever. For those subjective things, I think a lot of work lately we put into, or for the last couple of years, like into putting them in the right priority, like making sure that people understand them, and their impact on the overall business and what you're trying to do. Because I do think that people come in with all sorts of. Some people are like, I got a logo on Fiverr, we're good to go. Other people are like, I need to spend five weeks just thinking about the logo. Then we need to spend a bunch of money and time and exploring it. And neither one is necessarily wrong, I don't think. Yeah. But I do think there's these different personalities. So somehow you have to have like this, like what is the perspective it should be in, whatever the piece of creative, the subjective thing that you're doing is. Like where should it sit? How do you talk about here's what this needs to do? Once it does that, it's all, opinion after that, right? Like it needs to do this. And if you can establish that and then put it into a process, because, again, like it's hard. These things pull in different directions, right? But ultimately it has to come down to, you have to be able to give whoever, a designer, 5 hours to do this thing, or, there has to be an allocation. There has to be a timeline, a sequence of how things go. You can't just explore forever, I'm guessing. And so, the rubber meets the road in those places. And my point is if you don't have boundaries things that you're trying to, milestones that you're trying to meet, like this is the minimum this needs to meet, needs to do this, and this, and we have this amount of time to do it, or at least to get to stage one. And after that, you stop, right? Yeah. So get me something by this stage. That becomes really hard, but I feel like that is that kind of helps wrangle the really abstract thing.
Sure. And, when you work with all types of creatives, you're going to get a lot of different, artists. I consider myself an artist. You don't know when to stop. Like, you want to continue. A good artist will never be finished with their piece, right? So there is got to be a stop, and there's got to be a time where you're able to deliver a product. I would also add this, that the person who actually is creating the project that you're pitching to your client may not always be the person who should pitch it to the client.
Yeah.
Because I found that there's some really great creative, they stay on point, but they just couldn't talk about their creative in a way to a customer that was always going back to the strategy. For some reason, they just couldn't pitch it that way.
Not only that, but a great creative doesn't mean that they're a great communicator.
Yeah,
and that's a big part of it.
And
right?
I've noticed that when you get somebody like a smart customer who starts to poke a little holes and ask questions to creative, why did you do this? Why did you make that decision? Do you think that really challenges it? Sometimes, you need somebody who can actually come back to say, well, this is what we agreed on. This is the strategy. This is why we did it, is for the strategy. All they want to know is that your choices, because I'll back up for a second. I think a lot of our clients, they don't really understand the creative process, and they almost want just to validate that trustworthy, that you've thought through this stuff, right? That you've thought through the strategy and how it connects. But if you can convince them that your creative connects with the strategy, and there's intentionally every little piece of element of a design, of a video, of a message, of communication, it was so intentionally developed based on the strategy that was developed earlier, they're typically gonna go, okay, that makes sense.
I would actually go a step further and say rarely should the person that created the thing be the one that's pitching it or selling it to the client, because I think it's just a different skill set. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that there can't be people that have both, but there's the skill set of, creating, translating the thing into something, whatever. Let's say it's a visual or video, that skill set. And then there's a skill set of influence, of talking to someone and pitching it to them, and then telling them why this was made and why it actually will be what you need. Because a lot of times, in my experience, people don't know what they need and they don't know what they want, and probably more than anything else, they're communicating that they're uncertain, and you just need to bring them certainty, right? Like, thinking about someone right now that we're talking to, and they're just highly uncertain, and that's coming across by in different ways. What's this execution going to look like? What's this? But at the end of the day, they're conflicted in their own mind about what they should do, and so that's going to exist no matter how great an execution is. So it's a different thing that has to be done there. You need to bring certainty to that person somehow, and I do think with just a lot of these creative sides. These subjective elements, I think that exists a lot. Is just I don't think the person trusts their gut. They don't trust what they like necessarily, and that means that's going to be communicated to you. So unless you can bring certainty to really whatever the execution is, it could be almost anything. If you can bring certainty to it, then that gets them over that hump. Yeah, I think a lot of times,
I love this conversation because we're all kind of saying the same thing, but coming at it from a different angle, which is try to remove subjectivity, have a clear process, and bring clarity to the client, so that your value is not another voice that says this is a good idea. I think that's what so many creatives and agencies make is, we've got the best idea and we've got the best creative. That's not your job. Your job is to bring clarity and purpose and see how this fits into the overall strategy, and actually will make the client grow, make more money, and be better than when you found them.
What I find is a lot is when we unpack and start the strategy for the brand, what I notice is there will be multiple stakeholders that are client stakeholders, and many times they don't even know it, but they don't see eye to eye. And so what happens is, if you have 2 or 3 decision makers within a client, and they all have pull, you'll find that they don't see eye to eye. So when you pitch creative, they're not going to see eye to eye, because the strategy, they don't even see eye to eye. They don't even know. They think they know what they're building together. They think they're on the same page. But then once you start we do a lot of exercises with our clients, you start to see, you guys really don't know. And literally, I see arguments. They're not heated arguments, but I can see them they're right in my office with my clients, and they're arguing about really important things, because they were never brought to the table and challenged on it. And so we challenge a lot of our clients. And once we get them all on board, you have to get your client on board with the strategy first. If they're not on board with the strategy, they're never, you're going to waste your time on creative, because creative's time consuming and it's stress, and it's time, it's costly. And so you have to make sure that you get your client they have to understand who they are first before, and agree to that before you can pitch.
You said the word strategy. I know we at the beginning said, let's talk a little about strategy.
Yep.
I happen to believe that the idea of strategy is one of the most ambiguously understood things and interpreted things in the agency world, both on the people that think that they want strategy, the client side, and both on the agencies that say you need strategy. Now, I believe that you do need strategy. I think that is important, but it feels like the way it's defined and even the understanding of it is so broad that, how do you guys define strategy, and how do you make sure that what you're talking about with strategy is actually what someone is thinking? I've had there's a couple times, but one I'm thinking in particular, a client that they need strategic guidance, but they get caught up in the strategy, and at the end of the day started to realize, I don't think they know what they mean by strategy at the end of the day. What is the thing you're trying to do? And it was hard to finally figure out that, you pull that out of them. And so, I don't know, let's talk about that a little bit, and tell me, how do you define that?
I completely agree. Strategy is a very, it means different things. We've, in our agency, I have developed a process to be able to actually create the strategy. But it
strategy
is
to sell the strategy.
Yeah, it's different for everyone,
my friend.
Yes, what a great strategy. But really, what it is, it's guidelines, and it's
my strategy is sarcasm.
Path. Yeah, there you go. It's a path. It's a path.
It's very effective.
It's a path to be able to market a product or service, and it's the path, and it starts with a lot of understanding of what makes their product or services unique, and a lot of research. It starts to define. So we start really defining what we call our guardrails, like where we're going to, what sandbox are we going to play in, and what does that look like, and how broad is that, or is it small and thin, and what is the journey of the customer, and what does that journey look like, and how do we know we can convert a customer to a sale, and it includes so much that in the end they fully understand. Really, the strategy really helps them understand and define their sales channels as much as it does their brand. And so I think for everyone that's different. And I do it. I'm different.
Strategy has a guardrail. I think. I don't know. I think that would be that's a big component of what strategy needs to do, right?
Yeah. I think for me, I've defined it, because I think that it is a nebulous term and it's misused so many times, but I've boiled it down to 3 simple things. Strategy is what you're going to do, meaning what's the plan? What is it that you want to achieve? Mm-hmm. So it's what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, what are the steps to get there, and then measuring the results of what you did. To me, that's strategy. What you're going to do, how you're going to do it, how are you going to measure and show what you did? I think to me, that's a good strategy. And people can disagree and add 4th and 5th steps, but to me, it's just how, what, measure it.
Yeah. I would also, I mean, none of these are, I don't know, maybe is there a right with strategy? I don't know. But I would say from my perspective, I look at it the same way, like being able to put guardrails on something, being able to say, when you say what you're going to do, the way I would usually interpret that is, what is the end result?
That's right.
Not how we're getting there necessarily, like all the plans and those kind of things. That's maybe more tactical, but like, what's the end result? And then there's like this why component, which is like the approach. Because again, there seems to be this this challenge. I even see it like how strategy obviously blends into tactics, right? And as a natural progression, if you work on strategy and you keep going down that path and that to get it clearer and clearer and clearer, you end up at tactics that you're actually doing, right? So where does strategy end and tactics begin from like a delivery or a client standpoint?
I think it's all part of the same thing.
Okay, well then, so that's the thing, like, right? So there's these different opinions. I mean, to me, strategy is just something really simple, like, or at least it has to fulfill this kind of idea of something really simple, like how are we going to approach this thing in general? We're going to make it easier because we have these strengths. We're going to do this because we have these abilities. We're going to do this because the market's got this challenge. To me, that is, it's kind of weighted on that side. That's not necessarily right.
I think if you're going to sell strategy to a client and get them to give you money to execute on it, you have to provide a very clear documentation of what's the idea, what's the end result, what are the steps that you're going to do, and what are the expected results. I think if you don't have all of those, it's not strategy. It's just an idea, or it's just execution, or it's just we're a data company.
And I like what you said, that it should include how to measure those results, because in the end, you're going to have to prove to your clients that you made them money. Because if they, at the end of the strategy, if you launch something and they don't know if it really worked well or not, and they won't be with you in the future. Trust me.
And even if it fails, at least you have the measurements to say
you can tweak it.
This strategy doesn't work so well.
Yeah.
And I think I always go back, and when I think of strategy, if you go back and study, great war leaders and strategic thinkers, from the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire, they were extremely strategic of, we want to conquer this country. How are we going to do that? Well, we might get inside a giant wooden horse and do that. We might, come around and carry our boats across the river like the Vikings did, or whatever it may be. And then ultimately, the measurement of that was, did we succeed or did we fail? How many, more, conquering nations did we acquire? And, it seems very barbaric, but really that's where strategy started. It's the human experience of saying, what's the big idea and how are we going to pull it off?
Yeah.
And I think that's where you can be effective as an agency for the client is, again, bringing clarity, removing subjectivity, and having, like you said, a clear path.
Yep.
I have always considered it, again, I don't think there's like a clear definition, but the things that you do, like the tactics, they're really all the same, right? It's like building blocks, right? So everyone has back in those days, everyone has a sword. You fight, you do, like, there are these. So these are some tactical things. Strategy sort of gives the context of how that's put together, in my opinion, based on your strengths and their weakness, their weaknesses.
That's right.
Right. So like the way you may use those elements is different because we have this advantage, or the landscape looks like this, or because there's this particular context right now. So that's why I say in my judgment of it, like that why you're doing it component, or maybe, that contextual component's a heavy one in strategy. Because, I think when people, I think that you need some level of strategy for everything. It doesn't have to go to that level, but like you often see, we run into this all the time, especially in e-commerce. Like there are people that are just doing things and they're being successful, but they don't know why, because they're just doing things, and those things happen to be working, and there's no real strategy around it. And so, more often than not, we're actually reverse engineering a strategy so that this success that someone found, maybe somewhat by accident, I'm not saying always, but like the success that was found can actually be something that continues, versus, maybe it continues to work, maybe it doesn't, we don't know.
I think good competitive analysis is reverse engineering strategy, right?
Yeah.
It's like you're starting with, they had a measure of success. We're seeing, oh, they own the market share. They've sold X amount. They're running X amount of dollars on ads. Okay, let's go back and see how they did that to ultimately see, okay, that was their original idea. That's where they came from. So that's an interesting way to kind of learn and reverse engineer the whole strategic process.
I was reading an article, maybe about a year ago, I think it was. Maybe it was last Christmas, how Adidas actually took a different approach to their e-com. I don't know where it was exactly, but it was interesting how they spent about a year or more really doing more incentives for e-com, for discounts, and not as much of their branding. And so they converted a lot of their dollars to just quick sales. And they found that over a year, their brand was diminished by it. So they lost a lot of brand equity from their research. And they attributed it to cheapening their brand based on just trying to offer, discount incentives. And in the short term, they sold a lot of shoes and a lot of product, but they didn't feel like that was long term it was going to be valuable. Like in the end, it might actually hurt them in 5 or 10 years. And so
it's interesting. Yeah,
there's all these different strategies, and again, sometimes we live in a different era where we do have to kind of switch our strategy a little bit. But and it really depends on there's short term strategy, that's short term marketing strategy, and there's business strategy. And the business strategy is, what do I want to be in 10 years? And there's short-term strategy, which a lot of times as agency, we're really just involved in kind of more short-term, unless we're building a brand. And because a lot of companies and a lot of stakeholders, they don't think long-term in their business, especially if they're a startup. They're thinking like this 6 months. Like, how do I get through the next 6 months? Where you work with bigger brands, they might be thinking 2 or 3 years down the road and where their brand's going and new markets and so you have to think with them in those areas. And again, it's really difficult to say with a startup, hey guys, in 3 years, 4 years, we're gonna spend all this money right now because 3 years we want to be 3 or 4 years we want to be this. They're like, I don't care about 3 years.
Exactly.
I got months.
Yeah.
So
and I think in COVID, this is I'm time stamping this, but it's interesting just to see what clients would spend in discretionary income, and thinking of these more strategic services versus, I think 2020 is the era of, okay, I don't have time for strategy. I'm hearing this a lot.
Yeah.
I don't have time for strategy. I just need you to, give me the best solution. You're the pros, now execute on it. And while I think that's an interesting kind of place we find ourselves, I think too it can be dangerous and tempting for us as agencies to be like, all right, I just got to take new clients because we're struggling too, and then we got to execute on it, instead of spending the time and resources to really do what we know is the best thing, which is strategically help this client come through, bring clarity, and then execute the plan.
Yeah, I like this discussion a lot because it's putting some instructions or some guidelines around what even is inside of a strategy, and hopefully it helps some people with some ideas. It's definitely helpful for me. It's just interesting to see that. I do think that in this time, I'm seeing that as well, and it's really kind of counterproductive if you think about it, because it's kind of like saying, I don't have time for a recipe, just make me a cake.
Right.
And it's like, you may not, there's a spectrum with the strategy stuff, right? And so you may not need a full-blown 10-week dive into strategy, but like you do have to understand, like, why are we doing this? What are we doing it for? What's the end result look like? I mean, and that's part of the great thing about strategy is I actually believe it can be really, really small and simple and even just a thought, right. And it can be really, really complex and comprehensive. So, that's the challenge with selling it, right? Is like, which one of those is it?
Exactly.
And what I've found is it's obviously important to have some sort of a strategy, especially also for your agency, by the way. And then when you sell it though, somehow you have to like be on board with what that end result is, you know? Is it going to be a full comprehensive plan that goes down to every little detail of what you do? Is it going to be, you know, what is that? Because I think that kind of like creative, if you can't be bought in at the beginning, then I think it's got challenges as you go through it.
Yeah, this is good.
Yeah, every client's different. You know, you
Wow,
walk in.
Profound, Brad. Thank you.
Yes, I know. Every client's different, and
but that's the point.
And
right?
learning your clients from the get go, like, you know, when you first start working with a client, let's just say it's a startup, and they think a brand is a logo. You know, you've got a lot of work to do. Like, oh, we need a brand. Okay, great. No, we just need a logo.
Oh, we need a brand. Oh, no problem. I got one on Fiverr yesterday. We can move on next.
Yeah.
This is Brad's worst nightmare.
And I think maybe
I agree with you.
maybe we need a better language and communication around this whole idea, because I think, again, just like strategy, brand, it's just so nebulous, and it means so many. I think again, it gets back to bringing clarity, removing subjectivity, and maybe we can come up with some better words to really help a client see that, because, and I don't know that that's the answer. I'm just saying it just seems like this conversation has brought up so many things of like, well, what does brand mean to you, and how do we bring very clear instructions to clients?
I think for me, this conversation really helps me to put my focus on is how do I educate my client on building a brand, and almost more importantly, how do I educate my employees and staff to have stronger processes so they understand how to build a brand? Because sometimes when you're working with creative, they're very niched, and they think only about they think about the art sometimes, and they lose focus of anything else. And so I think, you know, one of the things is, how can I build better processes in my agency internally, so that everyone knows the next step, everyone knows what they're there to do and what they're not there to do, and how do we make sure that we get the best creative for the strategy. So those some good discussions.
Great, guys. All right. Well, next time we will talk about whatever we're going to talk about.
Amazing. Love it.
Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.